Even by the standards of superhero comics, Supergirl's long history is truly weird. From her ill-fated romances to being obliterated from existence and replaced by a blob of protoplasm that used to sleep with Lex Luthor, here are the most unbelievably bizarre pieces of Supergirl's buck-wild history. The single weirdest thing about Supergirl might be that she didn't show up for a full 20 years after the creation of Superman. Despite introducing Superboy in 1944 and Krypto the Superdog in 1955, DC Comics wouldn't get around to even attempting Supergirl for another 3 years after that. When they finally did get around to this whole Supergirl thing, she was originally introduced as a one-off character. Not only was this version not Superman's cousin, she actually died at the end of the story and was never seen again. The first version, the one with the hyphen in her name, showed up in 1958's Superman number 123, when Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen found a magic genie belt and wished her into existence. After a few encounters in which she and Superman kept getting in each other's way, Supergirl wound up exposing herself to kryptonite and then begging Jimmy to end her hellish existence. Pretty dark. Despite her unfortunate end, this Supergirl served as a prototype for the Girl of Steel that would be introduced the following year after readers responded well to the idea. Like Supergirl, Kara's relative inexperience with her powers would be a frequent plot point, and visually they were almost indistinguishable. Supergirl's costume was not only similar to what readers would see, it's virtually identical to the one Melissa Benoist would wear on the Supergirl TV show almost 60 years later. In 1959, Action Comics number 252 told the story of the Supergirl from Krypton and introduced readers to Supergirl for real. This time it was Kara Zor-El, Superman's cousin whose family had survived the destruction of Krypton when their home, Argo City, was blasted into space as a single intact chunk of the planet. Unfortunately, the explosion turned Argo City into kryptonite, poisoning the inhabitants and leading Zor-El to follow in his brother's footsteps by packing his kid into a rocket and shooting her to Earth. All things considered, that's a pretty plausible origin story by Superman standards. The weirdest part of the story is that Kara gets a pretty cold reception from her cousin. For 2 decades worth of stories, Superman had believed himself to be the only survivor of his home planet, alone in the universe. Finally, he has a connection to Krypton, someone else who has lost her entire family and culture. At first, he's welcoming, and then she asks if she can come live with him. Superman's response is to refuse on the basis of his secret identity being in jeopardy. In other words, he doesn't want her cramping his style at his bachelor pad. Instead, he gives her a wig and drops her off in an orphanage. That's how Superman deals with his only living relative in the universe. By and large, Supergirl's adventures in the 50s and 60s tended to follow the same pattern as Superman's, at least at first. Her first major love interest was Dick Malvern, a classmate who, like Lois Lane and Lana Lang before him, suspected Kara's secret identity and tried to trick her into revealing herself. As time went on, though, Supergirl's life got truly weird. In addition to a long-running romance with a cyborg from the future, Supergirl's primary romantic interest was a horse, specifically Comet the Superhorse. Just wait, it gets crazier. Comet had actually been a centaur back in Hercules' time, who, through a combination of curses and bizarre events, wound up living in space for a couple thousand years as a bulletproof flying horse who still had sentience. Whenever a specific comet came close to Earth, though, the magic would turn him fully human for a few days. So naturally, he kept all of this secret from Supergirl, assumed the human identity of ace rodeo rider Bronco Bill Starr, and dated Supergirl without ever telling her who he was. No romantic relationship in comics has ever even gotten close to being that weird. As you might have heard, 1979 saw the release of Superman the movie, which was kind of a big deal. With Christopher Reeve's performance as the Man of Steel, audiences loved the movie, which launched DC's flagship character into a full-on franchise. By the mid-80s and the release of Superman 3, enthusiasm for the Superman films had waned a bit, but they were still successful enough to warrant a spin-off. Thus, Supergirl, which attempted to recapture the magic and expand Superman's movie universe and didn't quite manage to pull it off. While Helen Slater received a fair amount of praise in the title role, the movie itself was pretty weird. For one thing, it had very little connection to the other Superman films. The only actor to appear in both was Mark McClure as Jimmy Olsen, without even a cameo from Reeve. Even stranger was the plot. The film pitted Supergirl against Faye Dunaway as an inspiring witch named Selena, who gets her hands on a Kryptonian artifact called the Omegahedron and tries to use it to summon demons. Still, Slater's wide-eyed earnestness in the part has its appeal, and her connection to the character has remained strong throughout the decades. Since Slater would go on to play Superman's mother Laura on Smallville, Superman's adopted mom Eliza Danvers on Supergirl, and even voiced Superman's mom Martha Kent in an animated film. In 1986, DC Comics launched an ambitious attempt to restructure their entire universe with a year-long event called Crisis on Infinite Earths. The main idea was to eliminate some of the aspects that readers had come to regard as hokey and overcomplicated, condensing confusing timelines down to a single streamlined universe. Given that he had a longer and more convoluted history than anyone else on the DC Comics roster, it's not surprising that the Superman books went through the biggest overhaul. Along with recasting Lex Luthor as a deeply corrupt billionaire businessman, the big changes came in the form of a new origin for Clark Kent that re-established him as the true last son of Krypton. In the new continuity, he was now the only survivor of the planet's explosion and eliminated the idea that he had his full powers before he was an adult. That meant no Superboy, no Krypto the Superdog, no Comet the Superhorse, and no Supergirl. To give the character an ending rather than just writing her out of the books, Crisis on Infinite Earths saw Kara sacrificing her life in order to save Superman, and with him, countless billions of innocent lives. The thing is, the way the effects of Crisis were resolved in the books, she wasn't a dead hero who was remembered in honor. Instead, in the new DC universe, she'd simply never existed. There was, however, an epilogue to Kara's story that cropped up in a pretty unexpected place. In 1989's Christmas with the Superheroes, a holiday anthology with a handful of stories, the ghostly dead man lamented the fact that while he could briefly possess the living, he'd always leave them with no memory of his heroic deeds. While he dealt with those feelings, a ghostly woman showed up and told him that heroism isn't done for recognition. In the final panels of the story, the woman gives her name as Kara, and while it doesn't mean anything to Deadman, it meant a lot to the readers. Crisis had done its level best to get rid of concepts like Superboy, Supergirl, and Krypto, but if you're familiar with superhero stories at all, it probably won't surprise you to learn that literally all of it eventually came back. Even putting aside the nostalgia that a new generation of creators had for their favorites, copyrights on characters like Supergirl are very valuable, and if they're not being used, they can fall out of the control of the companies that own them. Supergirl's return to the comics page isn't surprising. The fact that she did it in less than 2 years, however, is pretty surprising. To be fair, this wasn't Kara Zor-El. Instead, this Supergirl was a shape-shifting protoplasmic matrix created in an alternate pocket dimension by a morally good Lex Luthor, who made her look like his dead ex-girlfriend and gave her all of Superman's powers plus turning invisible. She then came to the regular DC Earth and moved in with Superman's parents, who called her May, short for Matrix, and she became the new Supergirl.
Whoa.
She then moved in with Lex Luthor too, who was actually the regular evil Lex Luthor who had transplanted his brain into a clone body and told everyone that he was his own son. A few years later, she symbiotically bonded with a dead teenager and split into a good Matrix and an evil Matrix, and might also have been an angel. Good thing we had that Crisis thing, huh? This new stuff was way easier for new readers to understand than she's Superman's cousin. If you think the post-Crisis Supergirl was complicated, get ready, because we're about to talk about Power Girl. Right from the start, she's a little more complicated, but the short version is that before Crisis, DC's multiverse contained a dimension called Earth 2, where they stuck all the characters from the 40s who had been rebooted in the 50s and 60s. Whenever they showed up, they were always presented as being a decade or two older than their mainstream Earth 1 counterparts, giving a home to characters like the original Flash, Green Lantern, and Superman. Superman still had a cousin on that Earth, but Earth 2's Kara Zor-El didn't go by Supergirl. Instead, this older version went by Power Girl, with a completely different costume. For some reason, Power Girl was considered to be more necessary for the post-Crisis DC universe, and managed to stick around once the universe was streamlined. The thing is, Power Girl was an alternate version of a character who no longer existed, from a universe that no longer existed, whose entire reason for being had been completely eliminated. The post-Crisis Power Girl could no longer be Superman's cousin, and creators spent the next 20 years trying to figure out what her deal was. The first big solution was that she was actually the granddaughter of a wizard from the lost continent of Atlantis, who put her in a magic crystal for 45,000 years. Then she got pregnant and gave birth to a magic, rapidly aging baby who was never seen again. Then she was a major character in a teen book that, when it got canceled, was revealed to have been a fantasy drawn in a child's coloring book. Then she was just Superman's cousin again. Simple.
I missed out on the whole thing, to be honest with you. I was confused by it. I was very confused by the whole thing, if I'm being honest.
If the concept of Matrix Supergirl wasn't weird enough, 1996 saw the launch of a new Supergirl series, in which Supergirl gained a new secret identity. This time it was Linda Danvers, a young woman who had unfortunately been kidnapped and sacrificed to the devil before her first comic ever even started. Matrix found her body and, overwhelmed with grief, bonded with her, merging her protoplasmic form and personality with Linda's, becoming a new Supergirl in the process. A little ways into the run, Supergirl spontaneously developed the ability to sprout fiery wings, and the book began to feature Wallace Johnson, aka Wally the God Boy, a boy who claimed he was God. It eventually turned out that Linda was an Earth-born angel, and that bonding with Matrix's superpowered protoplasm had allowed her human form to contain this divine essence. At this point, Supergirl was an angel who was also a teenage devil worshiper who was also a blob from another dimension, who was also somehow still connected to Superman. It wouldn't surprise you to learn that after a few years of this, they got rid of this Supergirl and introduced another one who was just Superman's cousin from Krypton.
Her name is Kara Zor-El from Krypton. She's my cousin.
Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite superheroes are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.